Okay, I am going to demo a Photoshop assignment that I usually teach in my first level digital imaging courses. And it is going to involve smart objects and how to use them, as well as a brief introduction to the healing brush tools and the clone tool. First thing I'm going to do, we're going to take a panorama and turn it into a planet. Now, I got the idea from a couple of articles, and I'll see if I can find them really quick. I have them saved in my email, but I don't want to necessarily show you my entire email account. Now, this video is new. I haven't seen that, but we don't want a 360-degree panorama, and that's so we can show the progress and process of using the healing tools. If we use a 360-degree panorama, there'll be nothing to heal. And honestly, the planet turns out a little bit less interesting. I believe it is this one. As soon as I see the layout, yes, this is the first one I came across. And they talk about how Pluto was kicked out of the party. But in this article, and it does not look like it's been updated, it is a little bit old, I think. I think I first found this in 2009 or 10 or so. But you can see there's various steps, and I'm just sort of scrolling through it. But, that's an end result that we'll be looking for. However, this one is more than likely not any of these articles that I have found, and this one's from 2011, this video, so I'm guessing it's not going to use smart objects. Oops, wrong link. And yes, this is also another one, which it appears that it does not use a smart object either. And reading through these articles, I thought this was a really cool visual, but there are some repetitive steps that you would have to go through each and every time if you weren't using a smart object to create an image. We don't want to do that. What we want to do is we want to find a couple of panoramas, and I usually suggest my students at least shoot one of their own. That rarely happens. But the minimum I require being done is 3. And this is also for educational purposes, so you can kind of get away with using somebody else's because we're learning some skills here in an educational environment. But on a Google image search, I'm going to go to Tools, and I'm going to find something that is larger than 2 or 4 megapixels. You can go much bigger, but as we are using a smart object in Photoshop, the file will get pretty big pretty quick, and we will end up having to save it more than likely as a large document format, or a PSB. I just changed one letter. Photoshop files have about a 2 gigabyte limit inside the software, which is weird because most of the files I do for digital imaging wind up being perhaps 3 or 4 gigabytes. But I'm just going to surf through these. This one looks pretty interesting. And I don't want to pull that thumbnail. I want to go to View Image. And sometimes it'll throw you, depending on how the link is sorted out, it'll throw you to, or what website it's linked to. It will throw you, instead of throwing you to an actual straight up download, it will throw you to this screen instead of throwing you to the actual image itself. I am going to pick something pretty big here. Let's see. Let's just go ahead and do, I think that original pixel size, it said it was something like 6,000, but I'm going to do 1920 by, we'll just make it as big as possible, 1920 by 1200. And then I'm going to download that. Just going to throw it into my downloads folder. And I am doing this from home, so if my download speed is slow, I apologize. I do try to stay current. This one I haven't seen before. I think I'm going to try this one. And I think after this one, I'm just going to attempt... Yeah, see, this is what normally happens in a Google image search when you click on View Image. Right-click on that, save image to downloads. Oh, that one loaded pretty quickly. I think I'm going to try to find a city now, because that will throw a little bit more complicated stuff into the mix. I've done this London Eye one before, and kind of like that Greek one, although that's 12,000 pixels there. If you have your settings set up in Google Image Search, you can kind of see the pixel dimensions when you hover over an image. Ooh, this pyramid one, that's awfully square though. Golden Gate Bridge would be nice. Okay, we'll just pick what looks like these Italian Roman ruins here. I was gonna say Greek, but that, I think I've actually been here. I mean, there's a lot of Roman ruins in Italy, obviously, but I don't know, this column setup thing. So it's taking a while. No, okay, while that one's loading, we'll switch over to Photoshop. I'm using 2017, so this video might get dated pretty quickly. And of course, it's going to show you some of my, there's some student work here. There's a couple of examples of some student work of the same project we're talking about. So I'm going to go to File, Open. Go to my Downloads folder. And really, I probably should wait for this one to finish downloading, because this might be the longest one. But it doesn't necessarily matter. That actually downloaded pretty quick. So in here, I'm going to, let's see, that one is 1298 by 84. The width is pretty important here. That one's 7131, and that's 1920. I am going to go ahead, and I'm going to use this big forum one as my base. Now, before I do anything, I need to establish that this is a JPEG. This is a JPEG file right up there, and the background here is locked. You know, this is how a JPEG opens in Photoshop. What I need to do is I need to right-click on this, and I need to go to Convert to Smart Object before I do anything else. What a smart object is, essentially, and you can see the layer name changed to Layer 0. A smart object is essentially a Photoshop file within a Photoshop file. I tell my students that it compares to kind of the movie Inception. We've got Photoshop files and Photoshop files. And it's not necessarily germane to a Photoshop file. You can actually have an Illustrator file if you've got a logo or something in a web layout, in a web design layout. If you've got a logo that you've developed in Illustrator as a vector, you can move that into Photoshop as a smart object. The point of a smart object, I'm going to save this real quick, Command S. And I'm going to switch my format to Photoshop here because I was just saving something. And I'm just going to save this to the desktop so I can keep it kind of handy. And I'll just say Planet Video Demo.psd. And that's always a good idea. And it's going to take a while to save that file, but now instead of my JPEG file name up here, I have my PSD, and that's what I want. If I were to try to save this as a JPEG file after converting this into a smart object, it would ask me to change the format anyway. So here is my parent document, and I'm going to perform some transforms on this. This has to happen after you've converted your background layer, your initial panorama, into a smart object. First things first, I'm going to grow the canvas size. And if I switch between menu items and key commands, it's just because either I happen to think that that I am doing a demo video, but mostly I'm sort of flying on muscle memory. So I'll right click, do copy the width. I want to make this a perfect square because we're going to eventually fit a circle in this. And down here, this anchor, in order to grow the canvas size, right now it's going to spread that height top to bottom. It's going to put equal amounts on the top and on the bottom. It's going to grow it from the center, in other words. But I'm going to make things easy for myself. I'm going to move that anchor to the top. And now it's just going to grow that extra height. It's going to add it to the bottom of the document, like so. All right, I'm going to switch to the Move tool. And these functions are kind of necessary. They are necessary, I should say. Zoom out a little bit. To get the smart object to behave. Basically, we're performing some transforms on this primary smart object. And then when we open that smart object here in a little bit, I'm going to move other panoramas in there, but not distort them at all. This is also non-destructive. So any changes that I'm making, so I'll stretch this. And we're also going to show you the use of 1 or 2 filters. And I'm going to get this to match the dimensions there. That's a little bit bigger than the canvas, which is fine. I'm going to hit enter. And we're not worried about scaling that in proportion. I committed the change by hitting the return key. There's also a little check mark up here you can click. We're not worried about that distortion because the next step we're going to do, actually, is we're going to rotate that image. We're just going to flip it vertically. It's going to flip the whole canvas. And this is important because of the next step. The filter we're going to use is under Distort, and it's called Polar Coordinates. Basically, this takes endpoints and pulls them to a middle. I don't know if I'm exactly describing that right, but there's only 2 choices here. And you can see it's already kind of doing something there. It looks a little funky, but I'll just go ahead and click OK and let that calibrate. And there's my wonderful planet. Now, you can see there's a seam here that's happening due to the discoloration or the color change between one end of the photograph and the other. And also we get this structural overlap here, which is problematic, and that's why I threw a structural element in there. But what's happened over here in our layer panel is, because this is a smart object, the polar coordinate filter is now a smart filter. And this is also non-destructive, meaning if I change my mind, if I want to go back in here and maybe try the polar to rectangular, which I don't think is that interesting, I can always change my mind on this smart filter. And so, yeah, it gets a little wonky when you do the rectangular to polar. But because this is a smart filter, I got to tell you, back in the day, before smart filters were a thing, if you had to get your filter setting right, because it was very difficult once you got further down the line with a few more layers and one layer had the filter on it and you decided you could maybe try something else or maybe something else needed to be tweaked. You could not go back into the filter and reapply it. You had to step backward through the history. Another little thing is that when you have a smart filter, it creates a smart filter layer mask like this. And that is selectable, and I can actually add and subtract to that layer mask as I see fit. So I can have different parts. Oops, brush. I always get those backwards. I can add and subtract to the smart filter layer mask as I see fit, and parts of it will be affected and not affected by the filter. So this part is hiding the filter function by masking, by covering up, by revealing the original image. More about masks in a different demo video if I ever get to it. But now we're going to deal with getting our other panoramas in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually double click on my smart objects thumbnail. Double click on it. Normally a warning pops up. I've dismissed it because this is my own laptop. But a warning pops up that says, hey, you're about to open this smart object as a separate document. It just warns you that. You can dismiss it if you want. And so now I've got a new document here, and you can see my panorama is returned to normal. Now here's the nature of a smart object. And it's also a PSB file. If I start a new layer here, and I just go in with my brush tool, and I paint on this, and I save it. Now this is a pretty big document, so this might take a while to save. You can see it's stuck at 58% there. Goodness gracious, this is taking a while. And this is what I meant by 2 megapixels on the Google image search is probably enough. So what you didn't see there is sometimes if the document's big enough, a dialog box will show up that it says it's updating the smart object. And basically what that means is you've saved this document, and then this document says, hey, it says to your original document, you need to update yourself. And see, there's my painted layer. So we'll just trash that. And this is where we save work from doing the functions that I highlighted in those articles that I pointed you to earlier. Because now, if I don't have to repeat that stretching the canvas, that adding the width to the height, and all that jazz. I can just go down here to Place Embedded. There's 2 different types of smart objects, by the way. There is an embedded smart object, which kind of follows your original, it does follow your original Photoshop document around. It just goes with it wherever you want. There's my forum. And that's what I'm doing right now. I'm placing an embedded smart object. And it'll just bring it in. And you can see this one's much smaller, but that's okay. I can just grow this. This one actually might be a 3-dimensional panorama. I wasn't paying... No, it's not, because I can see the edges there and the bottom corners don't line up. This sometimes happens, and it's okay, because I've overstretched my document. I'll switch to the Move tool here. I've overstretched my document to fit the panorama, the original panorama layer. Now what I'm going to do, just for giggles, I don't have to, but I'm going to switch off the visibility of the forum layer, and I've just got this one. I'll save this file and let this take a little while. The other type of Photoshop smart object is a linked smart object. A linked smart object would be much more useful for that Lego example, or I'm sorry, that logo example. It might also work for Legos. That logo example I was talking about before, where you have a logo in Illustrator in vector format that you've saved, and you're using it in maybe in Photoshop for a website's design. Maybe you've done some posters in Photoshop with some photography on it, and the logo also needs to be included in that. And let's say you're working with a client, and the client all of a sudden, like, I want, instead of a black logo on top of the photograph, I want a white logo. Well, if you have a linked smart object, you can go into Illustrator and save that linked smart object and change that color, and then across any of the different files, different Photoshop files that are talking to that same Illustrator file, that color change will be updated. Now, the issue with having a linked Photoshop smart object is that linked file, that AI file that maybe has your vector graphic in it, has to follow around your Photoshop files. They kind of, it's like a little puppy dog that has to follow it around. That won't leave you alone. It just follows you home. It has to follow it. Otherwise, you throw it on a thumb drive, you throw this Photoshop file on a thumb drive, and you take it to your client to show it off, and you open up your Photoshop file, you didn't think to put your linked smart object AI file along with it, and you don't get to see the logo because the Photoshop file can't find that linked smart object. But we're dealing with embedded ones, so these guys all play nice together by default. And so now I'll pop over to my smart object parent file, my actual planet one, and you can see that the transforms we've performed on the smart object, on the original image, are now being performed on the visible layer that's been selected in this document. And so now we have another one to fix. So I'll go back over here, and I'll pull in my next embedded smart object. Now, I shouldn't say, well, it's fine to say embedded smart object, but the point is now that smart objects are an official thing, I'll resize this in proportion by holding down the Shift key. And I'll just commit that change. These mountains look a little bit pushed and pulled. What's cool about oversizing one of your panoramas is that now you can kind of shift and stuff. And this one I can tell you will be problematic. I'm going to grow it just a little bit and level that horizon line. I'm just going to eyeball it. I could pull up a ruler and do it that way, but I'm just going to try to get that plane in front of those mountains as level as possible just by eyeballing it. What I was saying before, sorry I got distracted, but anytime you use place embedded or place linked, Photoshop by default will place it as a smart object. And so to keep confusion down, I'm just going to go ahead, even though these are smart objects, I'm going to go to rasterize layer. That way I don't have to confuse myself, because right now I could double click that panorama, and now I have yet another file to worry about. I don't want to confuse myself or my students. So I just tell them, go right ahead, and in this layer 0 file, render those layers so you don't get confused. Now what I'll do is I'll save this change. There we go. This is telling us that, this dialog box is telling us that the smart object in this file up here is being updated. Here we go. I'm really surprised it's taking that long. There we go. And we'll pop back over here. Now, the problem that's happening with this one is how this image, how any of these panoramas are cut off on either side. So the reason why I have such a gigantic seam here to fix is because on one side, my mountain stops right here. On the other side, it stops down here. When you touch those ends together, you get something like this. And for simplicity's sake, because I'm looking at the timed recording here, I'm already up to 23 minutes. So I'm just going to save this file because, and this is kind of why I used to be upset at this and not understand why Photoshop treats a layer visibility setting as a document change. But now, as we use smart objects more and more, it makes sense because it's the visual change to the object, and then what that visualization needs to be updated in the smart object. And I think now that I've got all of my panoramas in, I am going to go ahead and close this file. I don't need that unless I want to change the visibility of what panorama I'm looking at here. But this is where we can now begin fixing this seam. But for time-sensitive purposes, the basic functions of the smart object are there. They've been explained. And we have our transformations taking effect on multiple layers inside this smart object. So I'm just going to stop that there, and I'll do a new recording a little bit later of how we would go about non-destructively picking and choosing the fixes for the seam that's created right here. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope this was useful and informative.